Hi, I'm Sarah Schatz, and you're listening to Kindle Curiosity, a podcast for curious souls where we explore the creative process. This podcast is powered by the Kindle community on Patreon to keep things advert-free. Take a seat by the fire, and let's welcome today's guest. Very excited to introduce you to today's guest. Christa David is a fine artist and scientist. She makes collages, paintings, photography, and also works as a public health researcher. You'll also notice during this interview she mentions an upcoming trip to Bali, and Christa is on that trip now. So she's making art in Bali and she's documenting her adventures there over on Instagram. So when you finish listening to this episode, be sure to hop over there and check out her Insta stories and Insta feed. So without any further ado, let's get to today's episode. So let's talk about your childhood and how that led to what you do now.
So I think I was always like a creative child. I mean, I remember asking my mom about this and she'd be like, no, you was always like reading something or in a book somewhere. And I think I'm just very curious and I can like read or do almost anything, which can be a little troubling because sometimes it's hard to focus. But I was in love with science.
What do you think really sparked that interest in science?
I have very fond memories of my third grade science teacher, Miss Carter. And I would spend so much time in her room, just everything you can think of, playing with dirt, insects that live in dirt, building really cool things. Like I built this lung machine as part of my science project. And it was supposed to encourage people to stop smoking.
How did that work?
So it's basically take a 2-liter soda bottle. You stuff cotton balls in the bottom. So the cotton balls kind of represent the lung. And you put like a rubber stopper at the top. Or you can use clay. And you literally had to use a cigarette for this demo. I mean, that was a different era back then.
Right.
And my mom at the time was a smoker. And I remember making this thing. And all you have to do is compress the bottle to get the bottle to smoke. But over time, the cotton balls would get all ooky and like brown. And I remember taking this home and I entered into the science fair. And I was like, Mom, you got to stop smoking. And she actually did for quite a number of years. So I was always fascinated just by science and how it can be applied to life and like building things. So yeah, I have really good memories of that. I was dead set on going to like a high school that focused on science. That was my intention because in New York City, we had these specialized high schools and some of them were focused on math and science. So I was like dead set on going to one of those. But it was in 7th grade where my art teacher, we had to take art. It was a requirement. And she was just like, I think you should come after school and work on some more art. You're really good at this. Maybe you can go to one of the specialized arts high schools. And I was like, no, I'm going to go to one of the specialized math and science high schools. Now, mind you, at this time, I'm getting like A+ in math and science. It was like my jam. It was something I loved. I also loved history too, but art was sort of like a requirement we had to take, like an elective. So I said, sure, I'll apply. So my art teacher, she helped me put together a portfolio. I had to audition for LaGuardia High School of Music and Arts and the Performing Arts, which is, people know that school by the Fame movie. Mm-hmm. So it's like a full day audition. You have thousands of kids from all over trying to get in. They only have a couple hundred spots. It's a full day of audition. We had to do all these things like still lives and draw from your imagination, all this stuff. And I'm sitting here like, I am not going to get into this school because these kids are talented. They've been doing art since birth, whatever. Lo and behold, I got into this art school and I was like, wow, okay, maybe I should just go here and it'll be really cool. It was very rigorous. We had about 5 periods of art every single day. And then we had our academic classes like science, math, etc. So I studied art throughout high school, art history. I went through the full gamut of watercolor, sculpture, oil painting. And in addition to that, I took classes at the Art Student League, which is this sort of cultural arts institution in New York City. So I spent a lot of time making art. I spent a lot of time at the Met Museum. Like that was like an extension of our school. We had to spend a lot of time there roaming the halls. And it was when I got to college where I was just like, this is not practical. I had my daughter when I was in high school. So when I got to college, it was sort of like art is not practical to do. You need to be very focused because now you have this other person that you need to provide for. So I still have my love of science and math. So I majored in pre-med and history. And I think I stopped making art my freshman year. I was just like, this is not going anywhere. So it was then, and it wasn't until my senior year where I kind of stumbled upon the field of public health, and that sort of set me on that trajectory. But art has always been a part of my life. And it wasn't until, I want to say, 7 years ago when I started to re-engage my art practice. So, and it was mainly just for mental health reasons, just de-stressing after work, that kind of thing. And then it just started to get more and more serious. And here we are.
So I'd like to hear a little bit about what it means to be a public health researcher, and then we'll get into your art practice.
It's funny because a lot of people don't know what public health is. Well, actually, it's not cool. Anyway, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a very broad field. There are a lot of different types of public health practitioners. My wheelhouse was mainly in epidemiology, which is just studying the patterns and distribution of disease and death, right? So my job at the New York City Health Department, where I worked for 10 years, was I spent half of my career as like an analyst, basically just doing a lot of data analysis, looking at where are the neighborhoods where we have the highest death and disease. Who are those people? How can we come up with interventions to help them? As you can imagine, in areas like New York City, there's like this concentration of poverty and wealth. And as you can imagine, the folks who live in the poorest neighborhoods tend to have poor health outcomes. So I spent a lot of time just researching that, like what were those conditions? They were mainly chronic diseases like diabetes and asthma, et cetera. And then also working with a team of different type of public health practitioners who were on the side of creating programming and initiatives to sort of impact that. And sort of we were working in concert. So you had the researchers working in concert with the program planners, because our ultimate goal was we want to have healthier communities. We want equity. We want everybody to have an equal chance to live their fullest life, fullest potential, healthiest life, and have access, equitable access to all the resources that promote health, right? So now, and as I sort of progressed in my career, I was mainly in charge of directing how research happened in certain neighborhoods, namely the neighborhoods in New York City that had higher concentrations of African American and Latino populations. And as I was exiting out of that role, it was mainly about how do we understand what's going on in these neighborhoods, and how do we continue to do research that is in concert or in collaboration with folks in the neighborhoods, and how do we come up with solutions that can ultimately just help people live longer, healthier lives. So now I tend to get called in on projects that require me to do a little bit of analytic work, a little bit of writing, and sort of explaining what equity is, what are some ways to think about this in the sort of built environment, giving people guidelines. So I tend to get called in mainly as a consultant to think about ideas around equity and research. Like, how do we know that we've gotten there? Yeah, and I get called in to write papers for, scientific manuscripts and things like that. So it's like a mishmash of things that I'm getting called in to do. But again, I tend to only do things that I really care deeply about or feel like I can make some kind of contribution to. I'm very grateful for my public health practice, because the more consulting hours I pick up, and I can pick them up whenever I choose to, it buys me more time in the studio. With that said, I am very grateful for my collectors. I am very grateful when people do acquire my work, because it does allow me to make more work.
I think there's this narrative and this idea of what we have to be a capital A artist. and it just doesn't line up.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thing. And like people look down on artists who work or what. I was like, what are you talking about? We like to live indoors and we like fresh food and we like to have nice things. And selling art is, it's not impossible, but it does require a lot of effort because this is an item where to some people, they see it as a luxury. They don't see it as like, oh, I need to go out and spend this. Now, what I'm trying to do is to encourage people to understand how important it is to have art in your space or just to experience it. Whether you buy my art or somebody else's art, it's just such a good thing to live in a home where there is art around. And there's just such a good feeling to know that you are contributing to an ecosystem of living artists when you purchase their work.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to figure that out and how to communicate that best to people. But that is something that I truly believe. I truly believe that everybody should own a piece of art. I don't care what it is. If it speaks to you, get it. If it's in your budget, get it. If it's not, talk to the artist so you can figure out how to get it, because we're willing to always figure out a way to get you the art that you need. Yeah, so it's something that I'm constantly trying to do is encourage people to acquire art, to support artists in any way that you can, because we have a really unique job to do. I think artists can be, not all artists, but can be sort of the consciousness of a society. We get to take in information and then propagate ideas and hopefully truth about a situation. And we get to say things with our art that sometimes people don't have the courage to say. Sometimes people don't have the words to sort of express that idea. We're contributing to, I feel like the propagation of truth. If your art is aligned with what's going on and with yourself, I think naturally you're going to make art that is telling some kind of truth and hopefully waking people up in some kind of way.
So that kind of ties nicely into the next question, which is about your creative process. And I know you work in different mediums.
For any artist listening, you do not have to choose. You can have all sorts of practices. As long as you're clear on them and clear on what they provide, you don't have to feel like you need to choose. So my practice is like a 5-pronged practice. There is a research component. Just naturally, I spend a lot of time reading and like looking things up and investigating. It's just natural to me. There's a writing component. I spend time thinking about the ideas that I want to communicate in my work. There's a photographic component, just because that's sort of where I started years ago. This idea of just being present to my surroundings and like capturing them in photos for reference. I have a painting practice. And then I have a collage practice. I think what I'm known for online is mainly the collage and the painting practice. And the way that I describe those two is that I paint my feelings. Like in my paintings, you can get a sense of what I'm feeling. And then my collage work is what I'm thinking. A good portion of it is figurative, and that is intentional. I think with the abstract art, people have a hard time, or they probably won't admit this, but I've found that people have a hard time understanding what is going on in the work, or just they feel inadequate, that they don't have the language or the vocabulary to understand what is going on. Mm-hmm. And if that is you and you're listening, throw all of that out of the window, because a painting, I mean, there are lots of ways you can read a painting: composition, color, all these things. But when it comes to abstract expressionism, the intent is for you to feel something, stare at it a little while. If it resonates with you, it does. If it doesn't, that's totally okay. There's no right or wrong way to experience abstract art. I'm intentional with adding figures in my collage work because I know that it's a much more accessible thing for people, right? So if I put a Black woman in my collage piece, you are very clear that this is a Black woman. This is a person. There's something going on here. And it feels accessible to you because you're like, oh, I recognize this one. She has a face, mm-hmm. She has a body, arms, eyes, whatever. I can recognize this person as a person. And I do that intentionally because I do want art to be accessible. And then it's funny because when I look at who's collecting what, people are collecting the collages because I think they feel like, oh, I know exactly what's going on here. Even though, they may not have gotten the full intent of the piece, but they can definitely relate to most of it. So I'm very intentional about having the figurative component to the collage work. As far as my practice or my daily sort of way I'm making art, collage is very straightforward. There is the searching for images, there is the cutting, and there's the composition, and then the gluing. Very straightforward. What people don't realize is that a lot of my collage work is very simple as far as composition, but again, it's very intentional. I use very few pieces to try to communicate a very big idea. And in my collage work, my collages are pretty small, 8 by 10, 9 by 12, or 11 by 14. I am trying to achieve a sense of monumental scale with my collages. And it's funny because when people see my work in person, they always assume that it's much larger than it actually is. And I am grateful for that because I'm like, that is intentional, trying to create this monumental message and scale in this very small space. In order to do that, people don't realize it is quite challenging to compose with just a few images on a white page. They may be like, oh, my 5-year-old can do that. And I'm like, I doubt that highly because there's a lot of like research, like a lot of my images are historical images. The time periods are very intentional.
Yeah.
The motifs that I use are very intentional. And it's a very, like, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. So I may spend days just culling images. I use copyright-free images from national archives and public libraries from all over the country. And that may take days, and I just keep a cache. I'm always looking for images. And then I spend lots of time going to thrift stores and stuff, looking for old magazines, asking my friends. I use a lot of vintage National Geographics. Again, very intentional because of their very problematic history with sharing information about different people and cultures. Like, they know that, they've admitted to that, they've apologized for that, whatever, and they're trying to do better. So I tend to use a lot of these historical images and sort of add them into this new narrative. Hopefully that is a lot more tender and a little more accurate and just more in this celebratory space, and not trying to make these images be sort of this exotic thing that was originally intended. And then after I spend time finding the images, I spend time cutting. Cutting is my favorite thing to do. I have boxes and boxes of clippings that are organized by color, shape, faces, words, and I just keep boxes of clippings. And then I just start to compose. And it's usually whatever I'm thinking about at the time. I'll start to pull images for whatever happens. A lot of times things just happen and they're nice happenings or nice surprises. But I spent a lot of time making these collages. I'm always like amazed. The composition and the gluing may only take a couple minutes, but that piece took me weeks to figure out.
Yeah.
Because it stayed on the table, had this idea running around my head, so I just want people to appreciate how much time it goes into making things that may look simple, but it actually took a lot of thought.
It sounds like one of the challenging things about working with collage is when you have a certain vision and a certain idea that you're trying to get across, you're limited by the images that you have. You can't just paint what's in your mind. So that's an extra layer of challenge instead of, you're not just randomly taking 3 pictures and gluing them down on the page.
No, and it is. So sometimes I do feel, and I think now I'm starting to appreciate this about collage, like you gotta constantly source material because you do feel limited and you do feel stuck. And this is why my writing practice is important. It's because if something is not flowing and I'm not getting my thought down in this sort of visual way, I have to just write a note and move on because I don't have the materials for it. And I just have to remind myself as I'm going out hunting for material, that this is something that I want to do. But you do have to work with what you have. I see it as a good problem to have. It keeps my creative engines kind of going. Like I'm always thinking about my work. And it's like a problem I have to solve. I think the good thing about being an artist, one that has a significant amount of time to work, is that we get to solve problems in our practice. And I see it as a good problem to have. But yeah, collage artists, like we're working with what we have. And it's a good thing most days, but it can be a little frustrating on the days when I'm like, ugh, why isn't her arm this way?
Yeah.
So part of the way that I'm handling that, and I started sharing this on my Instagram a couple weeks ago or last week, is I'm starting to shoot my own self-portraits because I can get myself into the positions that I want to have in the collage. So I'm working on this self-portrait series, which is just photography based, but ultimately I'm going to take those photos and then begin to collage them into other stories.
Yeah, so combining those two different prongs.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you mentioned Instagram. I love your Insta stories. So maybe for those who haven't followed you on Instagram, you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So you can find me on Instagram, christadavid.art. I love Instagram. I think I got on Instagram when it first was in beta. I've been on it forever, and mainly for my photography work back then. But it's just, I love it. It has everything in one app. I just hope it doesn't continue to get so big that it becomes overwhelming. But when Instagram stories started, I just started hanging out there. One, because I do work alone and I work from home, and I feel like there's a little bit of accountability there, especially if I tell people, hey, I'm going into the studio. I'll let you know what I'm working on when I'm done. So I like to share my Instagram stories, definitely make coffee in the morning. It's just become a thing by accident. It wasn't intentional. It was just something I started a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. And then when I stopped doing it, or I would miss a day or two, people would DM me and say, hey, you haven't made coffee for us this morning. And then the whole Letty Bloom thing, people thought that I made that up, but I'm like, I was just telling you exactly what I'm doing when I'm making the coffee. Like, the coffee has to bloom. I make pour over. So it's like you pour the coffee, you let it bloom for 30 seconds. But it just became this sort of mantra that people love to hear. So I do that every morning, and I save all of them in my highlights so that people can go back and watch them. And I haven't missed a day so far this year, no matter where I am in the world. And soon I'm going to be in Bali. So we'll see how that goes, right? But I'm going to be prepared to make coffee every day. But I use the Insta stories to connect with people, hold myself accountable, and then also share work. I think for artists who are sort of out here independently trying to build a collector base, collectors need to see the work and see how it's being made and hear how you're feeling about it. And I've had people who have followed me on Instagram stories for months, and I see them and I engaged with them. I don't do a lot of selling in Instagram. I have to keep reminding myself that I need to, but people will watch for 3 months and then they'll snatch up 2 or 3 collages. And I'm like, see, you're just kind of like, the more people see, because people are buying you in addition to the work that may resonate with them. And a lot of times people just want to support you. So I use Instagram stories to connect with people. I use it to keep me accountable and not have me feel as lonely, because I do work quite a bit by myself. But it's definitely something I enjoy. I don't see it as like a burden. So I keep it very loose. I don't like anything that's too formal, because then it becomes so curated that it just becomes too much. Like, so you get whatever I got that day. And some days I'm just not in the best mood, but I still show up because that's my commitment. But then I'm also very clear that I don't want to be on Instagram stories if I'm not in a good mood, because I don't want to impact somebody else's day negatively. So I just tell people what's going on, and then I will tap out for the rest of the day. If I'm in a particularly good mood, then I'm on there all day. But I love it.
So going back to your art, how does curiosity play a part in your work?
I don't think any artist can be an artist without being curious. I mean, we literally spend our days trying to pull something out of the universe or heaven or wherever, the spirit realm, and make it into physical space. Like, we're trying to pull these things out of nowhere and actually have them be. And I think you have to be curious, one, to even think that you can take something that does not exist and make it exist. it's innate. So the best thing that an artist can do is to continue to stoke the fire of their curiosity, because it's inherent in the art practice and the art making practice. So I tend to, like this morning, perfect example, after my meditation, and sometimes in meditation, right after meditation, I'll feel like, oh, what comes up? For some random reason, the year 1854 came up. So I'm like, oh, what was going on in 1854? Lots of things were happening in 1854. The Republican Party started in 1854. The Nebraska-Kansas Act happened in 1854. There was a ship stopped in Cuba in 1850. I mean, it was just fascinating. So I just went on Wikipedia and started looking at these things. I don't know where it's going to lead me, but that's an example of, like, if anything sparks your curiosity, just go after it. Thank God for, like, I don't know what I would do without Google. And I'm of the age where Google happened in my lifetime. So I lived my life without the internet for a good little while. But now I'm sitting here like, oh my God, you have all this information at your fingertips. So any little thing that I'm curious about, I look it up immediately. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Let me go read some more about that. So I think I make it a practice every day to try to learn something new. It doesn't matter what it is. It can have a direct link to my art, or it can be something completely different. I read a lot. I read a lot of different types of things. I was asked the other day, like, who my artistic influences were. And I, jotted down some names, or, told this other artist some names. And I was like, I'm more inspired by writers than anything. So I think it's really important to to spend at least a few minutes a day just learning something new, no matter what it is.
I love that. You're very analytical with your work. I wonder if, because this has been my experience, I'm a creative person, but I'm also analytical. And sometimes I find that people don't consider that artistic, or try to push me into a management box or a supporting role instead of the creative. Have you had experienced that at all?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I tell people, and a couple people that I've worked with have sort of pulled me aside and been like, wow, Christa, you are equal parts left and right brain, because I do feel like I can use both of them. I am not one of these artists who is just, and God bless them, I've spoken to a lot of them who are completely right brain, and they're just like out here making fabulous art, but they are not thinking about anything as far as like how to keep your art practice going, how to make it sustainable. And it's God bless them, because not everybody's blessed with that left sort of side to really understand, okay, what am I creating? What is my output looking like? How do I manage this? How do I expand, just being very thoughtful about the business of making art. But I think I don't try to tell people how to experience me. I just let people experience me however they want to experience me. I'm very clear on what my strengths are. I'm very clear on who I am trying to be in this world. I have created my own space where I am working and using both my left and my right brain equally, and enjoying the fact that I have access to a range of skills that are helping me not only make art, but also make a business out of my art making.
Right. I remember you talked about that on another podcast. I think it was The Creativity Habit, and I'll be sure to link to that episode in the show notes, about the difference between your art practice and your art business. So I'd love to go a little bit deeper into that.
The reason why I separate them is because they are different. I think your art practice is you getting up every day or whenever you've decided, and you're going to wherever you make your work and you are doing your work, whether you feel like it or not. You are making yourself an artist. You're making work. You're exploring your ideas. You're taking things that don't exist, making them exist. And you have to do that in a very continuous way in order to get better as an artist. Like, that is your job as an artist. Art business is slightly different. This is where you have made a decision. In my case, I have made a decision that it is my desire to make a living from my art. That is the ultimate goal for me. When I get there, it will be a great day. And this whole idea of making a living from my art, one, because I feel like I deserve it. I want that. I want to be in a space where my job is to get up and go to my studio, make my work, prepare the work, send it to X, Y, and Z gallery or X, Y, and Z collector, be satisfied with the work, write about my work, talk about my work, and just be a full-time artist, teaching art classes, whatever the case may be. But in order to make a business, you have to be very clear on what it is you're trying to do. Like, you got to be clear on your numbers. Like, okay, how much money do you want to make? How much money do you need to keep your studio running? So for me, I've broken it up as first goal is build a sustainable art studio. Like, how much money do you need to make in order to keep making the work? That's step one. And then the next step is, well, how much money do you need to make in order to keep your life going? Like your basic necessities, food, shelter, etc. Okay, that's the next step. And then the third step is like, well, how much money do you need to cover all the basics, keep the studio running, and then do what people who have day jobs do, save for retirement, buy houses. So you have to have a plan if you're, as with any business, on like where you're going, how you intend to get there, and what avenues you're going to take to get there. That requires a lot of thought, and it can be very scary because you're like, oh my gosh, how do I quit my 6-figure job to make art. How do I get back to a place where that's what I'm doing without having to work 20 hours a day? But I think you can definitely have an art practice without having an art business. That is completely noble and fine. But if you're trying to make a business and like get a return on the investment, you have to do some extra things. And sometimes you have to get help, because I'm learning that I don't know anything about running a business. Like, I don't have any people in my family who run businesses or own businesses or anything like that. So I got to read the books, do the podcast, get the trainings. I mean, it's crazy. And some days I do want to be like, oh, this sucks. I'm going to go and get me a day job so I can go back to just having an art practice. But they are different. And I think you need to think about them differently. And it's okay to have one and not have the other. There's no pressure. And it doesn't make you less of an artist just because you're not thinking about selling your art. Like, that has nothing to do with being an artist.
Yeah. I think sometimes when creatives start to monetize their work, you can kind of fall down the rabbit hole of the business and lose the creative side of things. So how do you keep a balance between those?
Great question. Here's where my analytical brain comes in. I keep a timesheet of like when I'm going into my studio. Like, I got to put in my hours, like 4 hours a day. You need to put in your time. I keep a tab on my production. So right now I am in high production mode where I am trying to make as much work as possible, mainly because we're coming into the season where people are buying gifts and things for their home, that kind of thing. So I keep tabs on how much time I'm spending in the studio, how much work I am actually making, and then also other things like how I'm feeling about the work that I'm making. So those things are important. You can't just, I think what I was doing earlier was like, oh yeah, I'm in here, I'm making stuff. And I think it's so easy to get into like, oh, I'm just making stuff. But again, you have to like latch onto an idea and drive that thing to completion. So for me, with the collage work right now, I'm working on a set number of collages to do in a set period of time. And I'm doing that mainly so that I can figure out a couple things. 1, do experiment with some new techniques. 2, just get all of my ideas out there. And like 3, use the materials that I have in my studio currently. So I think it just takes a little bit of time to like really be clear on what is it that I'm trying to accomplish and come up with some metrics around how do I know that I'm accomplishing that. So track your number of hours in the studio, track your output. Your output may, depending on your medium, it may be very different. And then track how you're feeling about your output, because I think that that's important too. So that's how I kind of keep myself really focused on what I'm making. As far as like going down this rabbit hole of like getting too caught up in business, I tend to do like the businessy admin things only on certain days of the week, just because it can be a lot. Even though you can't see this, I have like a massive planner where I keep all of my lists. And if I'm in the studio and an idea comes up for like, oh, you need to go and email your accountant, do this, do that, I write it down. That's not the time for business. And then I come back to it on the day when it's like, oh, let's do the business side of it. Another thing that I do is I have various like little accountability groups with different artists and creative entrepreneurs where we check in. How's this going? You know, are you reaching a wall in your business in this way? So I have like support networks for the business side of it, but I do keep those to specific days and specific amounts of time, because at the end of the day, you can do all the business stuff in the world, but if you don't have any art or a product that people want that is good, it's for naught. So I spend most of my time making the work and being clear that my visual vocabulary and what I'm trying to accomplish in my work is solid and that I feel good about it. And then we do the other stuff, we're getting it out there and kind of drumming up support for the work and that kind of thing.
And then along the way, you're very naturally and organically sharing your process on Instagram.
Yes.
So you aren't putting like a forced marketing. I'm sure you have other marketing endeavors, but that one is kind of folded into your day.
Yes, I try to share just because, I mean, I don't get too caught. And I think this is something that people need to be mindful of. This is why you need to spend as much time alone making your own work and not looking too much at other people's work, because you want to be solid in what you're trying to communicate and that how you're trying to communicate. I do not do that whole, oh, somebody's selling these paintings with these colors that go with this couch, so let me try that too. I'm not into that. Like, I have to like my work and it has to pass my muster, pass my litmus test before I let it out. So I spend a lot of time not looking at other people's work and just feeling like, no, this is how I communicate. And then I share it. And then it doesn't feel, I'm also on the side of like, the people who are attracted to my work are going to be attracted to my work. I'm not necessarily trying to enroll people into loving my work. It's like either it resonates or it does not. And I'm okay with that. I am not going to change my work to resonate with you. So when I share snippets, I rarely ask people, should I do this? Should I do that? I don't necessarily need anybody telling me what to do with my work. Like, I have to trust my gut. With that said, I do appreciate critique and I do appreciate people asking me questions about my work, because it forces me to be like, oh, well, maybe I could do this a little differently. But like, yeah, I don't get too caught up in trying to make work to sell. If it resonates with other people, great. I want them to acquire it, admire it, talk about it. But my goal is not to make work to sell, because ultimately my work, my intention is to have my work live way beyond me and my ideas to live way beyond me. So I'm making art to communicate my ideas that I think are important and that I want to sort of live on. Again, it comes down to like, why are you making art? And there's no judgment toward people who are making art that is mainly decorative, or there's no judgment. That's fine. Long as you're happy with what you're making and you know why you're making it, make your art. That's all I'm saying.
Fantastic. I would love to hear your thoughts on the intersection or the overlap of art and science, because you live in both of those worlds. And I think people often think of them as very separate, but they do have a lot in common.
So I will say this, there's a whole world of science and art intersecting. Like, literally, there are like scientists working alongside artists. There's incredible work coming out of places like MIT. So there's literally a whole host of artists who are like using biotechnology. I mean, they're doing these really cool things. That is not where I'm at. So I would encourage people to really look at the sort of intersection of art and technology, everything from like clothing and like design and fashion and art. I mean, it's just all of it's intersecting. I think for me, I always go back to like the basics, kind of like what you learn in your first art class when you take your first lab. There's this scientific method. There's this process of sort of having a problem, having a hypothesis, doing the experiment, writing up your discussion. I tend to take that exact thing into my art practice. I like it because it's a nice framework for making work. There's this, and even though I don't think art is linear in any stretch of the imagination. But if you take all those components of sort of the scientific method, if you do all of those things as you're making your art, it's just going to make the art so much better because you get to spend a little bit of time just imagining what the solution is to the problem. You get a little bit of time to actually investigate and like do an experiment. For me, it's like, will this paste work and this ink work? Or would this paper and this wood work? And then you get a little bit of time to have a discussion or to like reflect on what is going well in your practice. And then there's this point of like, you get to now share all the things that you've learned. So when I think about science and art, I tend to look to things to give me a framework for how I can then conduct or do my art practice. So that's what I lean on science for in one sense. And then in another sense, it's just there's some ideas that have been propagated in science, in the history of science, that just fascinate me. And those ideas just show up in my work. Like there's a whole science around, and I spend a lot of time thinking about issues of like race and equity and justice. There's a whole science around, a whole history around people trying to use science to create hierarchies in the way that people are understood. It was absolutely horrible. It's a horrendous history, but it's so fascinating, right? That science can then be, because we see it as this sort of authoritative thing. And if you say something is science, it's supposed to automatically mean that it's true. So I like to think about those things. Like, how true is it? Like, what is left out of it? What's the intersection of not just science and art, but, you know, science and spirituality? Like, what's left out? What's added in? Who added it in? Like, these are all questions that I think about when I'm doing my work.
I get a lot of questions about finding your voice or being on brand. And you have such a solid sense of yourself and your creative vision. I wonder if you have any advice for creatives who might be struggling with that.
So the quickest way to get on brand and to get a voice is to do your work. That's it. And I'm because people will say to me, oh, your stuff looks all together. And I'm like, you know why it looks all together? Because I literally spend time just doing my work. And it just so happens that the ideas that I'm trying to communicate, there's this through line. And I didn't set out to be like, oh, let me curate all these things. I'm just doing the things that literally spark joy, curiosity, excitement in me. And I'm doing that consistently. And what's going to happen over time, because once you're in alignment with who you are and what you're about, naturally everything that you create is going to be aligned. Just automatic. Like, I can't explain it any kind of way. It's not something that I don't sit down and think about what's on brand, what's not. I don't think about those things. I simply say, I'm doing my work. This is the work that I'm creating. This is what I'm about. And naturally, you're going to see the pattern the more that I'm just submitting to being aligned in my practice. So the best thing that you can do is just do your work and do a lot of it. Make a lot of work. And yeah, trust your gut and get off of the internet. Stop scrolling and looking at other people's stuff. Study technique and the conditions under which people do their work. That's what I tend to get from artists. How is this person doing their work? Where are they working? That kind of thing. And it's less about what they're doing because I cannot replicate anybody's work. Like, I don't have the skill to make collages like Romare Bearden. Like, that's not my job. But I can learn from his example as an artist, his art practice, the ideas that he was trying to communicate. So I tend to say, just study technique and study ideas, but you can't replicate anybody's work. So don't even try.
Yeah, your voice is not something that you come up with in your brain. It's something that comes out naturally as you work.
Exactly.
So if someone wanted to dabble in collage for the first time, where would you suggest that they start?
Take whatever magazines you have on your coffee table, get some scissors and glue, and literally start. There's no right or wrong way to do collage. And I love it because literally all you need is, you don't even need the scissors because you can rip the paper, but you just need glue and a piece of paper and start to piece together things based on, say, for example, color. Maybe you just go through the magazine. You're like, I'm looking for all the blues because I want to make a nice blue background. Maybe you're going through a magazine. You're like, okay, I want to get all the words that have certain letters in them. So I'll cut those out. Or I'm looking for all the little babies in the magazine. I'll cut those out. There's no right or wrong way. I say just get started. And then, of course, I mean, especially if you're new and you're like, oh, I don't really know how to put things together. #collage on Instagram. And you'll get lots of ideas on that. There are also some different collage books that you can definitely buy. I think Collage by Danielle Christa. She is the Jealous Curator. She has a book. Yeah, so you can find a collage book, but I think it's mainly about just the act of finding a magazine, finding some glue, a glue stick, and just sitting down and cutting out things and pasting them down and seeing how that feels. That's a good way to start. And then see where that kind of leads you. I mean, that's exactly what I did.
Yeah. And I feel like we've talked a lot more about your collage. So before we wrap it up, would you like to share about your painting process?
The painting process is funny. It can be a struggle at times, but I tend to go to the painting process when I'm having a hard time communicating my ideas in the collage. Or if I'm feeling intense emotion about something, I paint. And painting comes in when I can't find the words, when all I can do is find some marks, some colors, and I put them together. And yeah, so I paint what I feel, and it usually comes about when there's intense emotion. I think now I spend a lot more time doing, if I had to do like a percentage, I spend 75% of my time making collages, 25% painting. And I really enjoy painting. I love the feel of the brush on the canvas. I love oil paints and acrylic. I mean, I love the act of painting, but I'm finding that it's usually, I have to be having some sort of intense emotions about something. And, I just go with it. It's fine. And I do have some new paintings that I'm working on now, which will be, available soon. And my color palette, I think I shared this on Instagram, is such an unconventional color palette. And again, this is where it comes like you have to trust your instinct and your intuition. I just go with the colors that I feel resonate with me and accurately sort of depict what I'm feeling. And it just so happens I'm in this season with this certain color palette that I would have never chosen had I sat down to be like, oh, let me pick this color, because they match. Like, that's not the process. So you just have to trust your instinct. And sometimes I'm like amazed at what I make when I'm painting, because I'm like, I did not intend for that to happen.
I love that. So it's your more intuitive practice.
Yes.
So we could talk for hours because I keep seeing little threads where I'm like, oh, we could talk about that or we could talk about that. So may have to have you back on in the future.
I love it.
But for now, where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
Well, of course, I have a website, which I would love for people to see. It's ChristaDavid.com. You can see my work there. You can sign up for the newsletter, which I usually send out updates to folks on my newsletter. And then, of course, I am hanging out in Instagram stories every single day, ChristaDavid.art. And those are the two places where you'll find me. And I would love to have more people to interact with, engage with, and to share with. So that's where you can find me.
Great. It's been so nice to talk to you.
You too, Sarah.
Kindle Curiosity is funded entirely by supporters on Patreon. You can pledge as little as $1 a month to keep this podcast advert-free. Learn more at kindlecuriosity.com or find me on Patreon as Sarah Schatz. If you'd like to support Kindle Curiosity without becoming a patron, you can subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Find all of the show notes from today at kindlecuriosity.com. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'd love to know what you think. You can find me on most social media as @Sarah D. Schatz. Thanks for listening, and thanks especially to all of my patrons on Patreon. P.S. I'd love to know what's sparking your curiosity. Share your moments of creativity, exploration, and wonderment with #KindleCuriosity.